They stripped her of her dignity in broad daylight because cowards love an audience. They tied Eliza Whitcomb to a stone behind her father's ranch under the hard summer sun of Laramie, Wyoming territory. She was 20 years old, scared enough to shake, but too stubborn to give them what they wanted. What they wanted was a hidden book, 17 names, and the last piece of land her father had died protecting. Deputy Amos Rusk watched with a badge on his chest and rot in his soul. Silas Kincaid's men told her nobody was coming. Then a lone cowboy stopped his gray horse at the fence line. He looked poor, tired, and harmless, which is one of the oldest mistakes wicked men ever make, because Gideon Vale had once been called the Ash Creek Ghost, and that name used to empty saloons before the first shot was fired. By sundown, those men would learn that taking a woman's dignity is a dangerous thing. When the wrong old gunfighter's still breathing, 3 miles outside Laramie, the summer heat sat over the prairie like a heavy blanket. The grass barely moved. Even the horses standing near the corrals seemed too tired to swat away flies. Eliza Whitcomb lay on a flat stone behind the ranch house. Her wrists were tied tight. Dust clung to her dress. A bruise had formed beneath one eye. The men around her were enjoying themselves far more than decent men should. One kicked dirt toward her boots. Another laughed every time she tried to sit up. None of them cared that the ranch belonged to her. None of them cared that her father had built it with his own hands. They only cared about what she knew. Silas Kincaid had been trying to buy Whitcomb Ranch for nearly a year. At first, he offered money. Then he offered threats, hidden behind polite smiles. When neither worked, he sent men. Eliza knew exactly why. Her father had uncovered something before he died. Something valuable enough to kill for, something dangerous enough to make powerful men nervous. The manifest claimed they carried supplies, flour, tools, laundry equipment, but Thomas Whitcomb had noticed things that did not belong. Voices, crying, fear. He started writing everything down, dates, names, routes. These were the names Thomas had carefully written down in his book. 17 young women who had vanished after accepting jobs that never truly existed. When Thomas Whitcomb died on a lonely trail outside town, the sheriff called it an accident. Eliza never believed it. And neither did the men standing around her that afternoon. They knew the book existed. They just did not know where she had hidden it. A heavy boot struck the stone beside her head. One of Kincaid's men crouched down. "Last chance," he said. Eliza stared back without answering. The man slapped her hard enough to turn her face. The others laughed. Deputy Rusk looked away, not because he was ashamed, because he was bored. That was when a horse appeared beyond the fence. Nobody paid much attention at first. Cowboys came and went every day. Most minded their own business. The rider wore a faded hat. His coat had seen better years. The gray horse beneath him looked nearly as tired as its owner. The man stopped near the gate. He studied the scene quietly. His eyes moved from Eliza to the ropes, from the ropes to the guns, from the guns to Deputy Rusk. One of the outlaws smirked. "You lost, old man." The cowboy did not answer immediately, so instead, he looked at the knot binding Eliza's wrist. Then he asked a question. "Who tied that knot?" The men laughed. Even Rusk smiled. It sounded like the strangest question in Wyoming. The outlaw stepped closer. "What difference does that make?" The cowboy finally lifted his eyes. For the first time, something cold appeared behind them. "More than you think." The outlaw reached for his revolver. That turned out to be the biggest mistake he would make all summer. The next few seconds happened faster than most men could follow. Years later, people in Laramie would still argue about what happened next, not because of how fast Gideon moved, but because of what happened after the shooting stopped. A hand moved, a body fell. Another man hit the ground beside him. A revolver spun through the air before landing in the grass. The laughter vanished. The prairie suddenly felt very quiet. And for the first time that afternoon, fear changed sides. But as Eliza looked up at the stranger, standing between her and 6 armed men, one question remained. If this quiet cowboy was willing to risk his life for a woman he had never met, what kind of past was riding behind him? And would that past save Whitcomb Ranch or destroy everything she had left? Fear had changed sides. A few seconds earlier, 6 armed men had been laughing. Now 2 of them were flat on the ground, another was clutching an injured hand, and nobody seemed eager to be the next man reaching for a gun. The silence felt strange. Even the flies buzzing around the corral sounded louder. Gideon Vale slowly lowered his revolver. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't showing off. He looked like a man finishing an unpleasant chore. The remaining outlaws stepped back. Deputy Amos Rusk suddenly found the sky very interesting. For the first time all afternoon, he wasn't acting like the biggest man in the county. Gideon cut the ropes from Eliza's wrists. She stood carefully. Her legs shook a little. That wasn't fear. That was anger. The kind that builds for months until it becomes heavier than fear. "Can you walk?" Gideon asked. She nodded. That was enough for him. He didn't ask questions. He didn't offer speeches. He simply led her toward the ranch house. The men behind them didn't interfere. Not one of them wanted another lesson. Inside the house, the air felt cooler. Eliza sat at the kitchen table while Gideon filled a tin cup with water. For a moment, neither spoke. The old grandfather clock in the corner did all the talking. Finally, Eliza broke the silence. She asked why he helped her. Gideon took a slow drink, then he shrugged. A man didn't need a special reason to stop something wrong. That answer somehow told her almost nothing. And somehow it told her everything. As the afternoon stretched on, Eliza shared the story she'd been carrying alone. She told him about her father. Thomas Whitcomb wasn't a rich man, wasn't a famous man, but he was respected. People trusted him. And trusted people are dangerous when they start noticing things. Months before his death, Thomas began noticing freight wagons crossing the ranch after dark. Everything looked legal, until one frightened young woman tried jumping from one of them. After that, Thomas started paying attention. After that, he started writing things down, names, dates, routes. He filled an entire book, 17 names in total, 17 young women who disappeared after accepting jobs that sounded too good to be true. Gideon listened quietly. The older he got, the less he interrupted people. Most answers arrived if you simply stayed silent long enough. Eliza eventually reached the hardest part, her father's death. The sheriff called it an accident, a horse-thrown rider. Case closed. But Thomas Whitcomb had ridden horses his entire life. Falling from one made about as much sense as a fish drowning. Gideon finally looked up. That was the first thing she said all afternoon that seemed to matter to him. Then came another question. Where was the book now? Eliza hesitated. Even after everything, trust didn't come easy. Not anymore. She admitted she had hidden it. The truth was, Gideon wasn't the first person she had asked for help. He was simply the first one who didn't walk away. By then, Eliza had already spent months protecting the ranch by herself. And that was exactly why Kincaid's men were after her. They didn't want revenge. They wanted silence, and silence was cheaper than a trial. As evening approached, Gideon stepped outside. The ranch looked tired. Broken fence posts, weathered boards, dry grass stretching toward the horizon. But something else caught his attention. Fresh horse tracks, a lot of them recent. Too recent. He crouched beside the dirt and studied them. Then he looked toward the western hills. The expression on his face changed only slightly. But enough. Back inside. Eliza noticed it immediately. What is it? Gideon stood slowly. His voice remained calm, almost too calm. Kincaid's coming back. Eliza felt her stomach tighten. Tonight, Gideon nodded. The sun was already sinking. Long shadows were crawling across the ranch, and somewhere beyond those hills, men were riding toward Whitcomb Ranch with unfinished business on their minds. But what neither Gideon nor Eliza knew was that one of those riders carried a secret capable of changing everything they believed about Thomas Whitcomb's death. One thing about trouble in the West, it rarely rides alone. As darkness settled over Whitcomb Ranch, Gideon knew the men coming back weren't just looking for a fight. They were looking for that book. And men who hunt evidence are usually more dangerous than men who hunt money. The last light of the day faded behind the hills. Eliza lit a lantern inside the kitchen. Neither of them spoke much. There wasn't much left to say. The truth was simple. Silas Kincaid wanted the book. And he wanted Whitcomb Ranch. Everything else was just noise. Gideon spent the next hour walking around the property. checking fences, looking at the barn, studying the hills, watching the shadows. Eliza finally noticed something. The man seemed to be measuring everything, not with a ruler, with his eyes, every gate, every window, every corner, like he was preparing for something or remembering something. When he returned to the porch, she asked the question that had been sitting in her head all day. "Who are you, really?" Gideon looked out toward the dark prairie. For a few seconds, he almost smiled. Not because the question was funny, because he'd spent years avoiding it. "I work cattle." That was all he said. Eliza rolled her eyes. Even after everything, he still wasn't talking. A few minutes later, the sound of hooves drifted through the night. Both of them heard it. Gideon stood immediately, not scared, just ready. But the rider wasn't one of Kincaid's men. It was an old ranch hand named Otis Creed, a man who had worked for Thomas Whitcomb years ago. Otis looked exhausted. His horse looked worse. The old man climbed down and delivered news nobody expected. The day Thomas Whitcomb died wasn't random. Someone had followed him from town. Someone had been asking questions about his movements, questions only a handful of people should have known. That information hit Eliza hard, deep down. She'd always believed her father was murdered. Now she was hearing it from someone else, which somehow made it feel more real. Otis stayed for supper. The meal wasn't much. Coffee, beans, bread, the kind of food that keeps a person moving without asking for thanks. During dinner, Otis mentioned another name, Nathaniel Pike, Thomas's old lawyer in Laramie. According to Otis, Pike had copies of certain documents Thomas didn't trust anyone else to hold. That changed everything. For the first time, they had a direction. Not a guess, not a rumor, a real lead. The next morning, before sunrise, Gideon and Eliza headed for Laramie. The ride took several hours. The Wyoming summer was already heating up. Dust followed them most of the way. At one point, Eliza noticed Gideon watching every rider they passed. Every wagon, every stagecoach, like a man expecting trouble, or maybe a man who had spent too many years surviving it. By late morning, the buildings of Laramie appeared in the distance. The railroad town looked busy. Freight wagons rolled through the streets. Workers shouted near the depot. Store owners swept dust from wooden sidewalks. To most people, it looked normal. To Gideon, something felt wrong. He couldn't explain it. Not yet. But experience had taught him something valuable. When powerful men start getting nervous, entire towns start acting strange.
Before we ride deeper into this story, take a second to subscribe if you're enjoying the journey so far.
Then grab a cup of coffee or tea, settle in, and tell me this. What time is it where you are right now? And where are you listening from today? Because what Gideon and Eliza were about to discover inside Laramie would reveal two shocking truths. The first would expose a secret Silas Kincaid had hidden for years. The second would finally force Gideon Vale to stop hiding who he really was. The closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous the truth became. Gideon and Eliza rode into Laramie expecting answers. Instead, they found silence. Nathaniel Pike's office sat on the corner of a dusty street near the depot. The sign was still hanging outside. The door was still there, but the place had already been torn apart. Drawers were empty. Papers covered the floor. Someone had searched every inch of the office, and whatever they wanted, they had probably found. Eliza's heart sank. For a moment, it felt like they were too late. Then a quiet voice came from outside. A young girl stood near the alley. She couldn't have been older than 16. Gideon recognized her immediately, not by name, by fear. He'd seen that look before. The girl introduced herself as Maggie Bell. When Eliza mentioned Thomas Whitcomb, Maggie's eyes filled with emotion. Her older sister Annie had disappeared almost a year earlier. One day she accepted a job offer. The next day she was gone. No letters. No messages. Nothing. Maggie reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Nathaniel Pike had given it to her 3 days earlier. He told her to hide it if anything happened to him. Unfortunately, something had. The note was short, very short, but it changed everything. It mentioned 17 missing women. It mentioned freight wagons. And it mentioned one name. Silas Kincaid. Eliza suddenly felt her father's presence again. For months, people had treated him like a paranoid old rancher. Now proof was beginning to appear. Not enough proof to win, but enough proof to fight. That afternoon, they walked through town asking questions. Most people avoided eye contact. Some changed the subject. Others simply walked away. Fear has a funny way of spreading, especially when money is involved. Then Silas Kincaid appeared, right there on the street, as calm as ever. Clean suit, polished boots, friendly smile, a man who looked more like a banker than a criminal. He greeted Eliza politely, asked about her health, asked about the ranch. Anyone watching would think he was an old family friend, but Gideon noticed something else. Kincaid never looked surprised, not once, as if he already knew exactly where they had been, exactly who they had spoken to, exactly what they had learned. That was when Gideon became certain. The town wasn't merely scared of Kincaid. Parts of the town belonged to him. As evening approached, trouble finally found them. A tall Texan named Caleb Dorn stepped into a crowded saloon. He wasn't there for a drink. He was there for Gideon. Everybody could feel it. The room grew quiet. Caleb began talking, then insulting, then pushing, trying to provoke a gunfight, trying to make Gideon draw first, but Gideon never moved. Not at first. Years ago, he might have taken the bait. Years ago, he might have enjoyed it. Not anymore. Eventually, Caleb shoved him hard enough to spill coffee across the table. The room froze. Gideon stood slowly. One quick movement later, Caleb crashed through a chair and landed flat on his back. The entire fight lasted less than 5 seconds. No gunfire, no speeches, just experience-beating arrogance. Caleb looked up from the floor, and suddenly his face changed. He stared at Gideon like he'd seen a ghost. Then he spoke words that made the entire saloon fall silent. "You're Gideon Vale." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the piano stopped. An old rancher near the wall whispered another name, the Ash Creek Ghost. Nobody looked impressed. They looked worried. That told Eliza more than any story ever could. For the first time in years, Gideon's past had caught up with him, and judging by the look on several faces inside that saloon, people still remembered exactly who he was. Outside, night settled over Laramie. Inside, Eliza realized the quiet cowboy who saved her ranch wasn't simply a drifter. He was a legend hiding from his own story. But before either of them could decide what that meant, Maggie came running through the saloon door with terror in her eyes, because she had just seen something near the freight yard that could expose Kincaid's entire operation before sunrise. She wasn't guessing. She wasn't repeating rumors. She had seen women being moved between freight wagons less than an hour earlier. And one of those women had called Annie Bell by name. Maggie was right. Long before sunrise, Gideon already knew Maggie had been telling the truth. Women were being moved through the freight yard, not supplies, not workers. Women. Before sunrise, Gideon, Eliza, and several railroad men loyal to Thomas Whitcomb moved quietly toward the freight yard. What they found matched every warning Thomas had written in his book. Women, hidden records, payment ledgers, names. For the first time, rumors became evidence. And evidence is something even powerful men fear. Inside the freight yard, the proof was waiting for them. The wagons, the records, the missing women, the lies. For the first time, Kincaid could no longer hide behind money, polite words, or people he had paid to look the other way. Kincaid arrived just as the evidence was being gathered. For the first time, the confidence left his face. He tried to explain. Then he tried to threaten. Then he tried to leave. None of it worked. Some battles end with gunfire. This one ended with something far more dangerous, the truth. Kincaid still tried to run. Men like him usually do, but he never made it past the loading platform. For the first time in years, money couldn't buy him another mile. Deputy Amos Rusk lost his badge. Silas Kincaid lost everything he had built on fear, and among the women finally found and accounted for was Annie Bell. Weak, frightened, and far from home, but alive. The sister Maggie had spent months praying for. As for Whitcomb Ranch, it stayed exactly where Thomas Whitcomb had always wanted it, in the hands of his daughter. The land was still there, the fences still needed work, the cattle still needed feeding, life was still life. But something important had changed. Eliza was no longer the frightened young woman tied to a stone under the summer sun. She had been humiliated, threatened, abandoned by people who should have helped her. Yet she stood back up anyway, and sometimes that's what courage really looks like. Not winning, not fighting, just refusing to stay down. A few weeks later, Gideon stood on the porch of the ranch as the evening sun settled across the prairie. For years he had been running from his past, running from old names, old memories, old mistakes. But something about Whitcomb Ranch felt different. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't looking for the next place to leave. He was looking at a place worth staying. Maybe that's the thing that stayed with me the most. A man can spend years searching for peace. Sometimes peace finds him first. I've always believed something. Most people are stronger than they think they are, not because life is easy, because life eventually asks something difficult from all of us. Maybe that's why stories like this stay with us. Somewhere in Gideon, we see our own regrets. Somewhere in Eliza, we see our own struggles. And somewhere in Thomas Whitcomb, we see the people who chose to do the right thing when it would have been easier not to. That's a victory worth remembering. Sometimes the strongest person in the room isn't the loudest. Sometimes it's the one who quietly refuses to quit. Before we finish, I'd genuinely like to hear your thought. If you were Gideon Vale, would you have walked away that afternoon when you first saw Eliza tied to that stone? Or would you stayed and risked everything for someone you didn't even know? Leave your answer in the comments. I read far more of them than you might think.
And if you enjoyed this journey, please consider giving the video a like and subscribing to the channel.
It helps keep these old stories alive and allows me to keep searching for more forgotten tales worth sharing. As for me, I think that's why I keep coming back to stories like this. Not because they're perfect, not because every ending is happy, but because they remind us that character still matters, even when nobody is keeping score. But before you go, there's one reason I wanted to tell this story. Not because of the gunfighter, not because of the outlaws, because every now and then, life puts ordinary people in impossible situations. And what they choose next becomes their legacy. One small note before we part, boys. This story was carefully researched and retold from various historical themes and frontier legends. Some events, characters, and details were adapted or expanded to provide stronger educational value, meaningful life lessons, and a more engaging storytelling experience. The images in this video were created with AI assistance to help bring the people, places, and frontier atmosphere closer to the feeling of the story. The thumbnail and title were also designed as emotional storytelling tools, helping convey the heart of the journey in a way that connects more deeply with viewers. The goal of this story is not to glorify violence, but to explore character, responsibility, and the consequences of our choices. If this story stayed with you for even a few minutes after it ended, then it was worth telling. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, leave a comment and let me know. Until next time, take care of yourself, take care of the people you love, and remember this: the strongest people are often the ones nobody notices until they're needed.